The quiet life of a medieval castle servant. Boring history for sleep. Good evening, my friend. Tonight, there is nowhere you need to rush. No bells demanding your attention. No glowing screens. No crowded highways. Only the slow turning of history, one quiet moment at a time. Close your eyes if you wish. Settle into your favorite blanket and allow yourself to wander nearly 800 years into the past. Tonight, you are not a king. You are not a famous knight whose name fills history books. You are not even a wealthy merchant. Instead, you are someone history almost forgot. A humble servant living inside one of England's great medieval castles. Your name will never appear in royal records. No poet will sing songs about your life. Yet without people like you, no castle could survive for even a single week. So let the world become quieter. Take one slow breath and step softly through the heavy wooden gates. Long before sunrise, the castle was already awake. The first sound was never the trumpet. It was never the church bell. It was usually the wind. The wind slipped between the stone towers, whispered through narrow windows, and rattled loose wooden shutters that had survived countless winters. Then came the distant clucking of chickens. Somewhere below the walls, pigs grunted impatiently. A horse stamped its hoof inside the stable. Before anyone important opened their eyes, dozens of invisible workers were already moving through the darkness. You were one of them. Your bed was nothing more than a simple straw mattress laid across rough wooden boards. It was not especially comfortable. The straw crackled every time you moved. Tiny pieces escaped through the cloth covering, and every few weeks the mattress needed fresh straw because the old bedding slowly became flat and damp. Blankets were made from coarse wool, warm enough during autumn, less convincing during January. On especially cold nights, you slept wearing nearly every piece of clothing you owned. The castle looked magnificent from outside. Tall towers, strong stone walls, colorful banners dancing in the breeze. Visitors imagined luxury. The people who actually lived there knew another truth. Stone was beautiful. Stone was also cold, very cold. Even during spring, the walls seemed to hold onto winter. Large fireplaces helped, but they could never warm every hallway. Long corridors remained chilly almost every hour of the year. Your day began before dawn because someone had to wake the fire. The castle fires rarely stayed alive through the entire night. Ash covered yesterday's coals. You knelt beside the fireplace with dry kindling collected days before. Small twigs, thin strips of wood, bundles of dried grass. Blowing gently, you watched tiny orange sparks appear beneath the gray ashes. At first, almost nothing happened. Then came a faint glow, a whisper of smoke. Finally, a small flame stretched upward. The room slowly filled with warmth. Not much, just enough to promise that breakfast might eventually be cooked. Fire was one of the greatest treasures inside any medieval castle. Without it, bread stayed hard. Water remained cold. Rooms became nearly impossible to live in during winter. Keeping fire alive required patience rather than strength. Nearby, another servant carried heavy buckets from the well. Water was needed everywhere, for cooking, for washing vegetables, for brewing ale, for cleaning wooden tables, for feeding animals, for making soup, for putting out dangerous fires. A modern kitchen simply waits for someone to turn a faucet. A medieval castle demanded endless walking. Every bucket represented another journey across uneven stone paths. One bucket could weigh more than 20 pounds. Dozens had to be carried every single day. As dawn slowly painted the eastern sky pale blue, the castle kitchen finally came alive. If modern restaurants seem busy, a medieval castle kitchen would have amazed you. Huge fireplaces stretched across entire walls. Iron pots large enough for several people to stand inside hung above glowing fires. Wooden spoons measured almost as tall as a child. Knives were sharpened constantly. Smoke drifted upward toward dark wooden beams blackened by centuries of cooking. Nothing looked polished, everything looked used. Because it was every day, breakfast depended on the season. Fresh bread if yesterday's baking had gone well, porridge made from oats or barley, cheese, sometimes onions, occasionally smoked fish. During better times, perhaps eggs. Almost everyone drank ale, not because people wished to become drunk. Instead, weak ale was often safer than untreated water. The brewing process removed many harmful organisms that medieval people could not even see. No one understood bacteria. They simply understood experience. Families noticed that certain drinks caused fewer illnesses, so they trusted tradition. The smell inside the kitchen constantly changed: fresh bread, boiling cabbage, wood smoke, roasted onions, wet wool drying near the fire. Herbs hanging from the ceiling: parsley, sage, thyme, mint, rosemary. Many herbs flavored food. Others were believed to cure sickness. Some probably helped. Others simply gave people hope. Hope was valuable in every century. Outside, sunlight finally reached the highest tower. The castle looked almost golden for a few peaceful minutes. Morning mist floated above nearby fields. Birds landed along the walls, completely unaware that soldiers had once defended these same stones against enemy armies. History often remembers battles. Nature remembers mornings. And every morning looked surprisingly calm. You stepped outside carrying a basket. Today's first task was gathering fresh vegetables from the castle garden. The garden sat safely inside the outer walls. It was not decorative. Every plant had a purpose: cabbages, leeks, beans, peas, turnips, onions, medicinal herbs, apple trees, sometimes small pear trees. Nothing wasted precious space. Every square foot mattered. Medieval people understood something modern supermarkets sometimes allow us to forget. Food required constant work. Rain mattered, soil mattered, sunlight mattered. A poor harvest could shape an entire year. You carefully picked fresh herbs while tiny drops of morning dew rested upon every leaf. The air smelled wonderfully clean. No automobiles, no factories, only damp earth, fresh grass, wood smoke, and distant animals. Some historians estimate that medieval England smelled dramatically different from modern cities. Not always pleasant, certainly more natural. Every village had its own mixture of smoke, livestock, baking bread, leather workshops, and muddy roads. The castle itself formed a small community, perhaps 100 people, sometimes 300, sometimes far more. Not everyone wore armor. In fact, knights represented only a tiny fraction of castle life. Most residents worked ordinary jobs. Blacksmiths, carpenters, stable hands, cooks, gardeners, brewers, bakers, messengers, tailors, priests, laundry workers. Each person quietly supported everyone else, like tiny gears inside an enormous clock. Few people noticed them individually. Yet without even one gear, the entire machine struggled. You returned to the kitchen before the lord of the castle had even finished dressing. That was perfectly normal. The higher someone's rank, the later their morning often began. Servants prepared the day before important people entered it. Fresh bread emerged from enormous ovens. Its golden crust cracked softly as it cooled. Few smells in history have matched fresh bread. It comforted rich and poor alike. One loaf might feed several people. Nothing was sliced evenly. No machine existed for perfect cuts. Each piece looked slightly different, just as every loaf carried the fingerprints of the baker who made it. Outside the castle walls, farmers had already begun plowing fields with teams of oxen. Their lives were even harder than yours. Yet they too followed familiar routines passed from one generation to the next. The rhythm of medieval life rarely changed quickly. Spring planting, summer growth, autumn harvest, winter repair, year after year, century after century, slowly, quietly, like the steady ticking of a clock no one could hear. And as the first full morning sunlight spread across the ancient stones of the castle, your long day had only just begun. The castle was fully awake now. Not suddenly, not with shouting or rushing. Instead, it awakened the way the countryside often did, one small sound at a time. A stable door creaked open. A rooster announced another morning, convinced the entire kingdom had been waiting for him. Somewhere high above, a raven landed on the battlements, tilting its head as though inspecting the people below. The castle breathed slowly. Every day followed familiar patterns. Predictable routines brought comfort, especially in a world where winters could be harsh, harvests uncertain, and news from distant towns might take weeks to arrive. For you, the morning continued in the great hall. Before the lord and lady appeared, the room needed careful attention. Yesterday's rushes, scattered across the stone floor, had become worn. In many medieval castles, Fresh rushes, soft reeds collected from nearby wetlands, were spread across the floor. They helped absorb dirt, moisture, and unpleasant odors. Sometimes fragrant herbs such as lavender, sweet marjoram, or chamomile were mixed among them, filling the hall with a gentle scent that visitors often noticed before they admired the tapestries. You carried a woven basket filled with fresh rushes. One careful handful at a time, you spread them evenly across the floor. It was simple work. Quiet work. The sort of work almost no one remembered. Yet everyone appreciated without realizing it. The Great Hall was the heart of castle life. It was far more than a dining room. Here, important guests were welcomed. Justice was sometimes delivered. Feasts celebrated victories. Travelers shared stories from distant lands. Minstrels performed music. Children played when no formal gathering was taking place. During difficult winters, nearly everyone preferred spending time near the enormous fireplace. The stone walls echoed gently. Even whispered conversation seemed to linger for a few extra moments. Sunlight entered through narrow windows. Glass existed, but it remained expensive. Many windows were covered with wooden shutters or oiled cloth instead. The room never felt especially bright. Instead, soft golden light drifted across wooden tables, polished smooth by countless hands. The tables themselves were interesting. Many were temporary. Long wooden boards rested upon sturdy trestles. After meals, servants removed them, allowing the hall to become open space once again. Furniture served several purposes. Nothing remained unused for long. As you dusted one of the heavy oak benches, your fingers followed tiny grooves carved decades earlier. Perhaps another servant had absent-mindedly scratched a small pattern while waiting for dinner to begin. Perhaps a young page practicing with a knife had left the marks. History rarely records such little moments. Yet they remain hidden inside old wood, waiting for someone to notice. Nearby, another servant polished silver drinking cups. Only the wealthiest households owned many pieces made from silver. Most people throughout medieval England ate from wooden bowls. Wooden spoons. Simple pottery. Occasionally pewter. Silver was valuable, not only because it looked beautiful. It also represented wealth that could be melted down if desperate times arrived. Nothing valuable remained purely decorative. Every object carried practical importance. Outside, the castle gates slowly opened. A pair of merchants waited patiently with two heavily loaded wagons. One carried barrels of salted fish from the coast. The other transported wool cloth woven in a nearby town. Trade connected even remote castles to the wider world. England during the High Middle Ages was far from isolated. Merchants traveled surprising distances. Some brought spices from lands thousands of miles away. Pepper from India, cinnamon from Sri Lanka, ginger from Southeast Asia. These precious seasonings passed through countless hands before finally reaching an English castle kitchen. A pinch of black pepper could cost more than many people imagine today. It was used carefully, never wasted. You watched as the gatekeeper inspected every wagon. Security mattered. Bandits existed. Smugglers existed. So did wandering strangers, whose intentions remained uncertain. Castles protected not only noble families, but also valuable supplies. Every sack of grain mattered. Every barrel mattered, especially before winter. Near the entrance, the castle blacksmith had already begun working. His forge glowed bright orange. The rhythmic sound of hammers striking hot iron echoed across the courtyard. Clang. Pause. Clang. Pause. Again. 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 The sound became part of everyday life. Few servants even noticed it anymore. Iron smelled different from wood smoke. Sharp, metallic, almost earthy. The blacksmith repaired horseshoes, sharpened farming tools, made nails, fixed broken hinges, crafted simple knives, occasionally repaired armor. Without skilled blacksmiths, medieval society simply could not function. Almost every profession depended on metal tools. Nearby, several children chased one another through the courtyard. Not every child inside a castle belonged to nobility. Servants raised families too. Children often began helping with simple jobs remarkably young. Fetching water, collecting eggs, gathering firewood, learning by watching adults rather than attending formal schools. Education looked very different. Books remained precious. Each manuscript required weeks or months of careful work. Everything was copied by hand. Letter after letter, page after page. Ink, parchment, patience. Owning even one book represented remarkable wealth. For most ordinary people, knowledge traveled through spoken words. Parents taught children. Masters taught apprentices. Priests delivered sermons. Travelers shared news. Stories carried history long before printing presses transformed Europe centuries later. The kitchen became busier as midday approached. Large cauldrons simmered above roaring fires. Steam curled toward dark ceiling beams. Today's main meal would include thick vegetable pottage. Pottage was one of medieval Europe's most common dishes. Its ingredients changed constantly. Cabbage, beans, leeks, onions, barley, peas, whatever happened to be available. If meat appeared, it was often a welcome luxury. Sometimes small pieces of bacon flavored an entire pot. Nothing was wasted. Bones became broth. Stale bread thickened soup. Vegetable scraps fed pigs. Ash from fireplaces sometimes found new life in making soap. People recycled because survival demanded it, not because someone encouraged environmental responsibility. Every object possessed value. Every resource mattered. Even broken clothing received careful repair. You noticed the castle baker kneading another batch of dough. His hands moved with practiced confidence. No measuring cups. No digital scales. Only experience. He understood the dough by touch. Too sticky. Add flour. Too dry. Add water. Every loaf depended upon judgment developed over decades. Nearby, sacks of grain rested against the wall. Most bread came from wheat when available. Poorer households often relied upon rye, oats, or barley. Harvest quality determined everything. One bad growing season could echo throughout the following year. Outside the kitchen, church bells drifted gently across the valley. The sound floated over forests, fields, small villages, rivers. For medieval people, bells marked more than time. They organized daily life. Morning prayers, noon prayers, evening prayers, special celebrations, warnings, funerals. Almost everyone understood the language of bells. Long before wristwatches or smartphones, sound connected entire communities. You paused for a brief moment. Only a few seconds. Long enough to hear the breeze moving through nearby oak trees. Long enough to notice sunlight warming the ancient stone beneath your feet. Long enough to appreciate something history often forgets. Even in difficult centuries, there were peaceful mornings, quiet afternoons, gentle winds, fresh bread, bird song, and ordinary people simply doing their best. The afternoon had only just begun, and many more quiet hours still waited within the old stone walls of the castle. By early afternoon, the castle settled into its gentlest rhythm. The excitement of the morning had faded. Breakfast had long since disappeared. The lord had met with his steward. Messengers had come and gone. The kitchen fires still burned, but now they crackled with a slower, steadier sound. If someone from the 21st century visited this castle, they might be surprised by one thing above all else. There was no constant noise. No engines. No telephones. No airplanes crossing the sky every few minutes. No distant traffic humming in the background. Instead, silence was the normal state of the world. That silence was rarely complete. Nature always filled it. The breeze slipping through oak leaves. A horse snorting in the stable. A blackbird singing from the castle wall. The gentle clatter of wooden wheels rolling over uneven stones. A dog barking somewhere beyond the gate. These sounds blended together into something peaceful. Something that modern life rarely allows us to hear. You picked up 2 empty wooden buckets and walked toward the castle well once again. The journey had already become familiar. Across the courtyard, past the bakery, around the forge where the blacksmith continued his steady work, toward the center of the castle. The well was one of the most important places inside the walls. Without clean water, even the strongest fortress could not survive. Many castles were designed with deep wells dug directly into solid rock. Some reached astonishing depths, hundreds of feet below the surface. Digging such a well required years of patient labor. Workers carved through limestone using simple iron tools. Every inch demanded effort. But once completed, the well became priceless. Even if enemies surrounded the castle, fresh water remained available. You lowered the heavy bucket. The rope slid slowly through your hands. Far below, there was a faint splash. Then silence. You waited. The bucket filled gradually. Then came the hard part. Pulling it back. Hand over hand. The rope grew heavier with every foot. Your shoulders tightened. Your hands burned slightly against the coarse fibers. No machine helped. Only patience. When the bucket finally reached the top, sunlight sparkled across the clear water. For just a moment, it looked almost like polished glass. You smiled quietly. Simple tasks often brought simple satisfaction. As you carried the water back toward the kitchens, a young stable boy hurried past. He could not have been older than 12. His boots were muddy. His hair refused to stay neat. One sleeve had already torn at the elbow. He apologized politely as he squeezed by with an armful of fresh hay. Children in medieval castles often worked from an early age. Not because childhood was unimportant, because every helping hand mattered. Many boys hoped to become apprentices. Some dreamed of serving as pages before eventually training as squires. Only a small number would ever become knights. Most would grow into craftsmen, farmers, merchants, or servants. Their lives might never appear in famous books. Yet they built the world around them. Inside the stable, the horses enjoyed their afternoon meal. The building smelled of fresh straw, warm leather, oats, and horses themselves. It was a comforting smell to anyone who spent enough time there. Each horse received careful attention. These animals represented enormous value. A trained warhorse could cost more than many families earned in years. Even ordinary riding horses required proper care. Their hooves were cleaned daily, their coats brushed, their saddles inspected, their feed carefully measured. A healthy horse could travel 50 miles in a day. An unhealthy one might become useless. The stable master knew every animal by sight. He recognized their personalities as easily as their markings. One mare disliked strangers. Another became restless before storms. An older gelding always nudged visitors gently, hopping for an extra handful of oats. Animals, like people, had habits. You paused for a moment to stroke the nose of a calm brown horse. Its breath was warm. Its ears flicked gently. For a few quiet seconds, neither of you hurried anywhere. Outside once more, clouds drifted lazily across the summer sky. The castle looked different during afternoon light. The gray stone seemed softer now. Warmer. Swallows darted through the air, catching insects with remarkable speed. Their nests rested beneath the wooden eaves. Generation after generation of birds returned to the same places. Long before anyone kept written weather records, people noticed these patterns. Nature became its own calendar. As the sun climbed higher, laundry workers carried large baskets toward the drying lines. Washing clothes in the Middle Ages required astonishing effort. Water first needed to be carried, then heated. Soap, often made from animal fat and wood ash, was rubbed into the fabric. Heavy garments were beaten, rinsed, wrung out by hand, and finally hung beneath the open sky. There were no washing machines, no electric dryers, only strong hands and patient hours. Clothing itself was valuable. A single wool tunic might be worn for years. When it tore, it was patched. When the patch wore thin, another patch replaced it. Fabric rarely disappeared into the trash. It simply continued changing shape until almost nothing remained. Near the garden wall, an elderly woman sorted medicinal herbs. Bundles of sage, chamomile, mint, yarrow, fennel, lavender, calendula. She had spent decades learning which plants soothed fevers, eased headaches, or helped wounds heal. Some remedies truly worked. Others relied more upon hope than science. Yet her knowledge was respected. Long before pharmacies existed, gardens often served as living medicine cabinets. The castle physician might visit only occasionally. But herbal wisdom lived with ordinary people every single day. As the afternoon slowly stretched onward, sunlight filtered through the leaves of a great oak tree standing just beyond the inner wall. Its trunk was enormous. Perhaps it had already been growing when your grandfather was born. Perhaps even earlier. Trees quietly witnessed generations. Kings came and went. Wars began and ended. Children became grandparents. The oak simply continued reaching toward the sky. You found yourself wondering how many servants had rested beneath its branches before you. Hundreds, perhaps thousands. History remembered crowns. The tree remembered everyone. The air carried the sweet scent of fresh hay from nearby fields. Beyond the castle walls, farmers continued their work beneath the warm summer sun. Some cut grass with long scythes. Others gathered bundles into neat stacks. Winter always waited in the distance. Every armful of hay collected today meant healthier animals months from now. People rarely worked only for the present. Every season prepared for the next. As shadows slowly lengthened across the courtyard, the pace of work softened once again. There would still be bread to bake, floors to sweep, wood to chop, candles to trim, animals to feed. But there was no frantic hurry, only the steady rhythm of another ordinary day. A day so ordinary that no chronicler would ever write about it. And yet, it was days exactly like these that filled most of human history. Not battles, not coronations, not famous speeches, just quiet afternoons, honest work, gentle conversations, and the peaceful life of ordinary people living beneath ancient stone walls. The evening was beginning to approach, and with it came the soft golden light that made the old castle seem almost timeless. The afternoon slowly surrendered to evening. The change happened so gently that few people noticed it. The bright sunlight that had warmed the castle walls all day began to soften into a rich golden glow. Long shadows stretched across the courtyard. The towers, which had seemed tall all morning, now cast dark silhouettes over the worn cobblestones below. For a brief time each evening, the entire castle appeared quieter. Even the ravens seemed less interested in calling to one another. The air cooled just enough to feel refreshing. You carried a bundle of split firewood toward the great hall. Every fireplace in the castle needed fresh fuel before darkness arrived. A castle consumed an astonishing amount of wood, not only for warmth, but also for baking bread, boiling water, cooking meat, heating bathwater on rare occasions, drying damp clothing, melting wax, forging iron, preparing medicines. Every fire represented hours of labor that had begun weeks earlier in nearby forests. Woodcutters selected suitable trees with care. Freshly cut logs were usually left to season before being burned. Green wood produced thick smoke and little heat. Dry wood burned brighter, hotter, and more efficiently. Medieval people understood this through experience, even if they never described it with modern science. As you stacked the logs beside the great fireplace, tiny pieces of bark scattered across the stone floor. The scent of oak filled the hall. Oak burned slowly. Ash burned steadily. Beech produced excellent heat. Each type of wood had its own character. Nearby, the steward carefully checked supplies. He carried a small wax tablet. Instead of paper, many daily notes were first written into soft wax using a pointed metal stylus. The surface could later be smoothed flat and used again. Parchment remained too valuable for everyday lists. Nothing was wasted, not even writing space. The steward counted sacks of grain, barrels of salted pork, bundles of onions, wheels of cheese, small casks of ale, clay jars filled with honey. Everything entering or leaving the castle had to be recorded. Running a medieval castle required remarkable organization. Without careful planning, even wealthy nobles could quickly find themselves without enough food before spring arrived. Outside, several chickens wandered freely through the courtyard. They scratched endlessly at the earth, occasionally discovering insects, occasionally discovering absolutely nothing. They seemed equally satisfied either way. Eggs were valuable. A healthy flock meant a reliable source of food. The castle cat watched them carefully from atop a wooden barrel. Not because it hunted chickens. It preferred mice. Every medieval castle appreciated good cats. Grain stores naturally attracted rodents. Cats protected precious food supplies more effectively than almost anything else. Few people spoiled them. They simply allowed them to do what cats have always done. One small gray kitten chased its own tail near the stable door. The older cats ignored its foolishness completely. Some things, it seemed, had changed very little across the centuries. The castle baker removed another batch of bread from the enormous oven. The loaves were darker than modern bread. Their crusts were thick. The aroma drifted through nearby corridors. Warm, comforting, familiar. Bread was more than food. It was the foundation of nearly every meal. Different households enjoyed different qualities of bread. The finest white bread belonged to the wealthiest tables. Most servants ate darker loaves made from mixed grains. Yet fresh bread always brought quiet satisfaction regardless of its color. You helped carry several heavy baskets toward the pantry. The room remained pleasantly cool throughout the year thanks to its thick stone walls. Shelves held carefully arranged food. Dried peas, beans, barley, salt, nuts, apples stored for winter, garlic hanging from wooden beams, strings of onions braided together. Everything had its place. Good organization prevented spoilage. And spoilage meant hunger. Preserving food required remarkable creativity. Salting, smoking, drying, pickling, fermenting. Long before electricity, people developed countless methods for making harvests last through cold months. Every successful technique represented generations of observation. Some knowledge traveled through books. Much more traveled through families. As evening approached, several travelers requested permission to spend the night inside the outer gate. Hospitality formed an important part of medieval life. Not everyone received entry, but respectable pilgrims, merchants, or messengers often found shelter. Travel remained slow. Roads were rough. Bridges sometimes disappeared after floods. An unexpected storm could easily delay a journey by several days. Safe lodging mattered. The gatekeeper asked polite questions. Where had they come from? Where were they going? Had they seen any trouble upon the roads? Travelers carried more than goods. They carried news, stories, rumors. A merchant arriving from London might describe markets unlike anything local villagers had ever seen. Another traveler might speak of a new bridge being built many miles away. Perhaps someone mentioned unusual weather in the north. Information traveled only as fast as people walked or rode. In many ways, conversation itself became the medieval newspaper. One elderly traveler entertained several servants while waiting near the gate. He spoke softly about seeing enormous cathedrals under construction. Buildings so tall, he claimed, they seemed to touch the clouds. Whether every detail proved true hardly mattered. People listened with quiet fascination. The world beyond the castle always felt larger after hearing a traveler's tale. As sunset approached, the chapel bell rang gently. Its sound floated through the cooling evening air. Many residents paused briefly for prayer. Faith shaped nearly every part of medieval daily life. Church festivals marked the calendar. Saints' days interrupted ordinary routines. Births, marriages, deaths, harvest celebrations. Nearly every important event carried a religious ceremony. Even people unable to read often knew Bible stories through stained glass windows, wall paintings, sermons, and songs. The castle chapel itself remained beautifully simple. Stone walls, wooden benches, small candles flickering quietly, colored light passing through narrow stained glass windows. Silence lived comfortably inside that room. Outside, the sky slowly transformed into shades of amber, rose, and deep blue. The first evening star appeared above the western hills. You paused for only a moment, long enough to notice how peaceful everything seemed. The smoke rising lazily from the kitchen chimney, the horses calmly chewing hay, the distant laughter of children finishing their games, the cool breeze carrying the scent of fresh grass and wood smoke. History often teaches us about extraordinary moments. Great battles, powerful kings, famous queens, remarkable discoveries. But most people never experienced those moments directly. Most people experienced evenings exactly like this one. Quiet, predictable, gentle, filled with ordinary work and simple comforts. And perhaps that is why these forgotten evenings deserve to be remembered. Because they were real. They belonged to millions of ordinary people whose names have disappeared from history, but whose lives quietly built the world that followed. Night was drawing closer now. Candles would soon replace sunlight. The castle gates would close until morning. And another peaceful chapter of medieval life was about to begin. The last light of the day lingered for only a few quiet moments. Then, almost without warning, evening became night. Unlike the modern world, darkness in the 13th century was truly dark. There were no streetlights glowing beyond the castle walls. No porch lights in distant farmhouses. No headlights winding along country roads. No glowing windows from neighboring towns stretching toward the horizon. When the sun disappeared, the landscape slowly dissolved into shadow. Only the moon and the stars remained. Inside the castle, the first candles were lit. One by one. Their small flames flickered softly against thick stone walls. The light was warm but never very bright. A single beeswax candle produced a gentle golden glow. Most servants, however, rarely enjoyed beeswax. It was expensive. Tallow candles made from rendered animal fat were far more common. They were practical. They were affordable. And they carried a faint, unmistakable smell. People hardly noticed it. It was simply part of everyday life. You carefully carried a lit candle through one of the narrow passageways. Its flame danced each time a cool draft slipped through the castle. The corridor seemed longer at night. The familiar stone walls looked different beneath flickering light. Shadows stretched and shifted with every step. Nothing felt frightening. Only quieter. Much quieter. The castle itself seemed ready to sleep. The kitchen, however, still had work to do. The evening meal had ended, but cleaning had only begun. Large iron pots were scrubbed with sand and handfuls of coarse straw. Without modern soap, rough materials helped remove baked-on food. Wooden bowls were rinsed. Knives were wiped dry to prevent rust. The long tables were cleaned carefully, then moved aside to create more space in the great hall. Ashes were gathered from the hearth. Some would later become useful for making lye, an important ingredient in medieval soap. Almost nothing ended its life as waste. Every material found another purpose. Near the fireplace, an older cook stirred the remaining pottage. Tomorrow morning, it would be heated again. Many medieval stews remained on the fire for days. Fresh ingredients were added. The pot was never truly empty. Each meal became part of the next. Its flavor slowly deepened over time. To modern visitors, the idea might seem unusual. To medieval families, it was simply practical. Outside, the heavy wooden gates swung shut. The gatekeeper and two guards worked together, pushing each massive door until it met in the center. The sound echoed across the courtyard. A deep, solid, ancient sound. Then came the thick iron bar. Slowly lifted, carefully lowered into place. The castle was closed until dawn. Anyone arriving after nightfall would have to wait outside. The surrounding countryside grew remarkably peaceful. A cool breeze moved through the nearby fields. Somewhere beyond the walls, an owl called into the darkness. Another answered from farther away. The stars seemed brighter than most people today have ever seen. Without electric lights, the night sky revealed astonishing detail. The pale band of the Milky Way stretched from one horizon to the other. Thousands upon thousands of stars shimmered above England. Many medieval people knew those stars well. Sailors navigated by them. Farmers watched the changing seasons through them. Travelers found direction beneath them. The heavens served as both calendar and compass. You stepped into the courtyard for a brief moment before returning indoors. The air smelled wonderfully fresh. Cool stone, damp earth, wood smoke rising gently from the chimney. Somewhere nearby, horses shifted quietly inside the stable. One stamped a hoof. Another snorted softly before settling again into the straw. The castle cat began its nightly patrol. Unlike people, it seemed perfectly comfortable moving through darkness. Its green eyes reflected the candlelight for an instant before disappearing beneath a wagon. A mouse would likely have an unfortunate evening. Life inside a medieval castle depended upon countless unseen workers. Some walked on 2 legs. Some walked on 4. In one corner of the courtyard stood a large rain barrel. Although the well supplied drinking water, rainwater served many other purposes. Washing clothes, cleaning tools, watering gardens. Medieval households wasted very little. Nature provided valuable resources. People learned to use each one wisely. Back inside, the steward checked tomorrow's tasks. A messenger would leave shortly after sunrise. The blacksmith needed fresh charcoal. The stable roof required a small repair. 2 barrels of ale were expected from a nearby village. Nothing dramatic. Nothing historic. Simply another ordinary day waiting to begin. And perhaps that is the most remarkable part of history. Most days were ordinary. For every famous battle, there were thousands of peaceful evenings. For every royal ceremony, countless loaves of bread were baked. Thousands of candles were trimmed. Millions of buckets were carried. History often remembers the extraordinary. Life was built by the ordinary. A young servant yawned quietly while folding clean linen. Another finished polishing wooden cups before placing them neatly upon a shelf. An older woman spun wool beside the fatting fire. The spinning wheel had not yet become common in much of medieval England, so she worked patiently with a drop spindle. The spindle turned slowly between practiced fingers. Twist, pull, wrap, again. The rhythm was almost hypnotic. Thread became yarn. Yarn became cloth. Cloth became clothing. Simple movements connected entire generations. You found yourself sitting near the fire for the first time all day. Not because every task had disappeared. Because there was finally a moment to breathe. The flames crackled softly. Occasionally, a small spark floated upward into the chimney. The warmth reached your tired hands. Your boots still carried a little dust from the courtyard. Your shoulders ached from lifting water buckets. Yet there was a quiet satisfaction in honest work completed. Tomorrow would likely look much the same. The fires would need lighting again. The bread would need baking. The horses would need feeding. The floors would need sweeping. The vegetables would need gathering. The castle would wake once more. And so would you. Outside, the moon climbed higher above the ancient towers. Its silver light touched the stone walls, making them appear almost gentle. The banners that had fluttered proudly all afternoon now hung almost still. The wind had settled. Even the ravens were silent. The great castle, so busy only a few hours earlier, had finally grown calm. It rested beneath the stars exactly as it had done for generations. And somewhere within those thick stone walls, wrapped beneath a coarse wool blanket on a simple straw mattress, another forgotten servant quietly drifted toward sleep. While history continued, one peaceful night at a time. Sometime during the deepest part of the night, when nearly everyone in the castle was asleep, one person remained awake. The night watchman. His footsteps echoed softly along the stone walls. Slow, steady, unhurried. He carried a small lantern, whose gentle light barely reached a few feet ahead. Every hour or so, he paused to listen. Not for voices, not for approaching armies, simply for anything unusual. A horse becoming restless, the creak of a loose gate, the smell of smoke where there should be none. Fire-frightened medieval castles more than enemy soldiers. Stone walls did not burn. Everything inside them did. Wooden roofs, floor beams, furniture, bedding, clothing, food stores. One careless flame could destroy years of work in a single night. That is why the watchman often looked upward. He watched chimneys as carefully as he watched the darkness beyond the walls. The castle slept beneath a clear summer sky. The moon had crossed high above the towers. Its pale light washed over the courtyard, turning familiar places into quiet shades of silver and gray. The well stood perfectly still. The stable doors remained closed. Only a gentle breeze stirred the banner above the keep. Somewhere beyond the walls, a fox barked in the distance. The sound was short and sharp. Then silence returned. For a few peaceful hours, it seemed as though the entire kingdom was asleep. Eventually, the stars began to fade. Not all at once. The eastern horizon slowly turned from black to deep blue, then to a softer gray. The first hint of another morning appeared. Long before the sun itself. The watchman smiled quietly. He had seen this moment hundreds of times. Every sunrise felt familiar. Yet no two were exactly alike. He walked toward the small bell near the inner courtyard. Its sound would soon wake the earliest workers. Not loudly, just enough to begin another day. You stirred beneath your rough wool blanket. The castle was still cool. Stone walls held the night's chill long after summer mornings had begun. For a few moments you listened. Nothing rushed. No alarms. Only the distant bell. The soft movement of someone walking through the hallway. The quiet rustle of straw beneath your mattress. Then you sat up. Another ordinary day had arrived. You folded your blanket carefully. Even small habits mattered. A tidy sleeping space made tomorrow's evening just a little easier. The room itself was simple. A wooden chest stood near the wall. It held nearly everything you owned. A spare tunic, a wool hood, a leather belt, a pair of mittens for winter, perhaps one treasured personal object, a small wooden carving made years ago by your father, or a smooth stone collected beside a river during childhood. Ordinary people owned very few possessions. Every object carried meaning. Every item had earned its place. Outside, the courtyard slowly awakened once more. The stable master opened the doors. Warm air drifted outward, carrying the familiar scent of hay and horses. The animals greeted the morning with quiet snorts and gentle movements. They too followed routines. Feed, water, brushing, exercise. Animals often seemed calmer than people because they accepted each day exactly as it arrived. The baker entered the kitchen before almost anyone else. Bread required time. The dough prepared yesterday had rested overnight beneath clean linen cloths. Now it had risen beautifully. The baker uncovered each bowl with practiced hands. He pressed gently into the dough with one finger. The surface slowly sprang back. Perfect. Without thermometers. Without timers. Without electric ovens. Only knowledge passed from one generation to another. The great oven had been warming since before dawn. Firewood crackled deep inside. The thick stone walls slowly stored heat. Once the proper temperature had been reached, the remaining embers would be swept aside. Only then could the bread begin baking. The smell arrived gradually. Warm flour, fresh yeast, a hint of smoke. It drifted through nearby hallways long before the first loaf emerged. Even today, scientists know that the aroma of baking bread can trigger feelings of comfort and safety. Perhaps people 800 years ago felt exactly the same. In the garden, tiny drops of dew rested on every cabbage leaf. Spider webs stretched between herb plants, each thread decorated with sparkling beads of water. For a few brief minutes, the garden looked almost magical. Soon the rising sun would dry every drop away. Beauty often lasted only a moment. Perhaps that made it even more precious. You collected fresh parsley, a handful of sage, several onions, 2 baskets of peas. The herbs released their fragrance the moment they were touched. The morning air smelled wonderfully alive. Nearby, bees drifted lazily from flower to flower. Medieval gardeners welcomed them without fully understanding pollination. They simply knew healthy gardens welcomed bees. Experience often taught truths long before science explained them. As the sun climbed higher, more servants appeared in the courtyard. Someone carried clean water. Another swept yesterday's dust from the entrance. A carpenter examined a loose wooden shutter. The blacksmith had already lit his forge. Soon the familiar rhythm returned. Clang, pause, clang, pause. The castle's heartbeat had begun again. A messenger prepared for a journey to a nearby manor. His horse stood patiently, while saddlebags were fastened securely. Inside the leather bags rested sealed letters. Wax stamps protected each message from curious eyes. Written correspondence moved slowly across medieval England. A letter might require several days to travel what today would take only a short drive. News itself moved at the speed of horses and tired feet. The messenger adjusted his cloak, accepted a small pouch of food for the road, mounted his horse. With a polite nod to the gatekeeper, he disappeared beyond the castle walls. For a moment, you wondered what distant villages he might see, what rivers he would cross, what stories he might hear before returning. Travel remained one of history's greatest adventures. Most people, however, rarely journeyed far from home. Their entire world often stretched no farther than a day's walk. Yet within that small world, they found friendships, families, work, faith, laughter, hope, and purpose. The castle behind you continued its quiet routine. Smoke rose gently from the chimneys. Fresh bread cooled upon wooden racks. Children chased chickens through the courtyard until an amused cook shooed them away. The morning sun warmed the ancient stone walls once again. Another peaceful day had begun. Another day that would never be recorded in a king's chronicle. Another day that quietly shaped history all the same. By the middle of the morning, the castle had found its familiar rhythm once again. Nothing hurried. Nothing seemed rushed. The work simply continued, one quiet task flowing naturally into the next. If you stood at the highest tower and looked across the countryside, you would notice something remarkable. The world moved much more slowly than it does today. There were no straight highways cutting through forests. No railroad tracks stretching across the hills. No airplanes leaving white lines across the sky. Instead, narrow dirt roads wound gently between fields and villages, following paths that had often existed since long before the castle itself had been built. Some roads were little more than tracks made by generations of wagons. Others followed the ancient routes once used by the Roman Empire centuries earlier. Many of those old Roman roads remained among the finest roads in medieval England. Their builders had laid strong stone foundations so well that people continued using them for hundreds of years. You watched a small group of villagers arrive at the outer gate. One man carried a basket filled with fresh eggs. Another brought a wheel of cheese wrapped carefully in cloth. A young woman balanced 2 clay jars filled with thick cream. These were not merchants from distant cities. They were neighbors. The castle and the surrounding village depended upon one another. The villagers offered food, labor, and skilled craftsmanship. In return, the castle offered protection during uncertain times. It was a relationship built slowly over generations. Inside the kitchen, preparations for the midday meal quietly continued. Large bundles of leeks rested upon one table. Turnips filled woven baskets. Fresh herbs waited beside a wooden chopping block, worn smooth by decades of use. The cook sharpened a long iron knife against a whetstone. The sound was soft, steady, almost soothing. Sharp tools made work safer. A dull blade required greater force. Experienced craftsmen understood this well. Nearby, another servant carefully sifted flour through a fine woven screen. Tiny clouds of white dust floated briefly through the warm sunlight streaming across the room. The flour felt incredibly soft between your fingers. Nothing about making bread happened quickly. The grain first had to be planted, then harvested, then threshed, then winnowed, then carried to the mill, then ground into flour. Only after all of that could baking finally begin. Every loaf represented months of work. Perhaps that is why people valued bread so deeply. In today's world, a loaf can appear almost effortlessly on a grocery shelf. In the Middle Ages, every slice reminded people of the seasons. Outside, the castle carpenter examined a heavy oak door that had begun sticking during damp weather. Wood is a living material, even after the tree has been cut. It expands. It contracts. Humidity changes its shape. The carpenter patiently shaved away only a few thin curls of wood with his hand plane. Not too much. Just enough. A skilled carpenter understood that every door, every beam, every chest had its own personality. The castle itself constantly demanded maintenance. Roofs needed repair. Mortar between stones slowly crumbled. Wooden staircases wore smooth beneath countless footsteps. Iron hinges rusted. Rain found tiny cracks. A castle was never truly finished. It simply continued changing. You carried several empty sacks toward the granary. The building stood slightly apart from the kitchens. Inside, the air remained cool and surprisingly dry. Tall wooden bins held precious stores of grain. The steward inspected them frequently. Moisture could ruin an entire harvest. So could rats. Cats wandered freely here, earning their keep without anyone asking them to. One large striped tomcat slept comfortably atop a pile of sacks. He opened one eye as you entered, decided nothing interesting was happening, and promptly returned to sleep. His confidence suggested he had chased enough mice to deserve a quiet afternoon. The steward smiled. "A good cat," he said quietly, "is worth more than 10 traps." It was the sort of practical wisdom that rarely appeared in books. Yet nearly everyone agreed with it. Near the chapel, an elderly monk carefully copied a page from a beautiful handwritten manuscript. Each letter was formed slowly, patiently, one stroke at a time. Ink made from oak galls rested inside a small pottery jar. A sharpened goose feather served as his pen. One mistake could waste an entire sheet of costly parchment. So he worked without hurry. Decorated capital letters bloomed into delicate patterns of vines and tiny flowers. Even simple books became works of art. Before the invention of the printing press, every book represented hundreds of hours of careful labor. Knowledge itself had weight. It occupied shelves. It traveled slowly. Yet because books were so precious, they were treasured deeply. As you stepped back into the courtyard, sunlight warmed the ancient stones beneath your feet. A gentle breeze carried the scent of freshly cut hay from fields beyond the walls. Somewhere nearby, a shepherd guided sheep across a distant hillside. Their soft bleating drifted faintly through the morning air. The castle blacksmith paused for a moment to wipe sweat from his forehead. Even before noon, the forge had become wonderfully hot. Iron glowed bright orange inside the fire. With practiced hands, he placed a horseshoe upon the anvil. One careful strike, then another. Not hurried, not wasted. Every hammer blow had purpose. Watching a master craftsman at work was almost like watching music. Each movement flowed naturally into the next. Years of practice made difficult work appear effortless. The sound of hammer against iron echoed gently across the courtyard. Not loud enough to disturb the peace, only steady enough to remind everyone that another ordinary day continued unfolding beneath the summer sky. You paused beside the well once more. Its cool stone rim had been worn smooth by countless hands over hundreds of years. Children had leaned upon it. Soldiers had drawn water before long journeys. Servants like you had filled thousands upon thousands of buckets. Generations came and went. The well remained. It asked for nothing. It simply continued, giving water to everyone who needed it. History often celebrates kings, queens, and conquerors. Yet perhaps the quiet well served more people than any king ever could. The chapel bell rang softly across the castle. Not urgently, simply marking another peaceful hour. The sound drifted outward across gardens, workshops, and nearby fields. For just a few moments, many people paused where they stood. Some bowed their heads. Others simply listened. Then, as gently as it had paused, the ordinary day continued, and the castle carried on exactly as it had yesterday, and exactly as it would tomorrow. By late morning, the warmth of the sun had settled comfortably over the castle. The dew had disappeared from the gardens. The stone walls, cold only a few hours earlier, now held the gentle warmth of the summer day. From the highest tower, the countryside stretched in every direction like a patchwork quilt. Green meadows blended into golden fields of barley. Small streams reflected the sunlight as they wound quietly through the valley. Clusters of oak, ash, and elm trees stood like islands in a sea of farmland. In the distance, faint curls of smoke rose from the chimneys of tiny villages. Each one represented families beginning another ordinary day. History often speaks of kingdoms. People lived in villages. You carried a small basket toward the herb garden once again. The castle's physician had requested several fresh plants before noon. Medicine in medieval England depended heavily on nature. The garden served as a living collection of remedies. Neat rows of sage grew beside thyme. Mint spread enthusiastically wherever it could. Rosemary filled the air with its rich fragrance whenever a breeze brushed past. Lavender attracted buzzing bees from every corner of the garden. There were also herbs that modern visitors might not recognize. Feverfew was often used for headaches. Yarrow was believed to help stop bleeding. Comfrey was sometimes applied to broken bones and bruises. Some remedies truly contained helpful compounds. Others worked mainly because patients believed they would. Even so, medieval healers carefully observed which plants seemed useful. Their knowledge, though imperfect, was built upon generations of experience. An elderly woman knelt among the herbs. She gathered chamomile flowers with remarkable patience. Not every blossom, only those fully open. She smiled as she noticed you watching. Plants, she said softly, cannot be hurried. It was wise advice, not only for gardening. Nearby, the castle orchard rested quietly beneath the bright sky. Apple trees were among the most valuable trees in medieval England. Fresh apples could be eaten in autumn. Others were carefully stored for winter. Some became cider. Others were dried to last through colder months. Pear trees stood nearby, their branches already heavy with young fruit. Fruit represented more than sweetness. It provided important nourishment during seasons when fresh food became scarce. The gardener inspected every tree with careful eyes. A broken branch today might mean fewer apples months later. Patience was one of the greatest skills a gardener could possess. Nothing in nature followed human schedules. Beyond the orchard, the kitchen garden continued producing vegetables that formed the heart of nearly every meal. Leeks swayed gently in the breeze. Broad beans climbed simple wooden supports. Cabbages spread their broad green leaves close to the soil. Turnips hid quietly beneath the earth. Everything growing there had been planted by hand, watered by hand, harvested by hand. The castle depended upon these modest plants far more than upon expensive spices from distant lands. Inside the workshops, another kind of quiet work continued. A cooper shaped wooden staves into a sturdy barrel. Barrels were everywhere in medieval life. Ale was stored in them. Salted fish traveled inside them. Grain, flour, vinegar, and even nails could be kept safely in wooden casks. A well-made barrel could last for many years if treated carefully. The cooper worked without measuring tapes. He relied instead upon trained eyes and experienced hands. Each curved piece of oak had to fit perfectly beside the next. A barrel that leaked was nearly useless. One that remained watertight became an invaluable tool. Close by, the castle's leatherworker sat beneath an open window. The smell of tan leather mixed gently with beeswax and linseed oil. He repaired belts, saddles, scabbards, pouches, boots. Leather was expensive enough that almost nothing made from it was thrown away. A boot might receive new soles several times during its lifetime. A saddle could serve multiple generations. People repaired what they owned because replacing it required enormous effort. A swallow swooped low across the courtyard. Then another. Soon several birds darted gracefully through the warm air, catching insects almost faster than your eyes could follow. They nested beneath the eaves of the stable roof every spring. The stable master claimed they always returned to the same nests. Modern science confirms he was often right. Many swallows show remarkable loyalty to familiar nesting sites. Without realizing it, medieval people had become careful observers of the natural world. They noticed the arrival of migrating birds, the flowering of certain plants, the first frost, the changing length of daylight. Nature quietly kept the calendar. The church bell marked the approach of noon. Its clear tone rolled across the countryside. In nearby fields, farmers paused briefly to wipe sweat from their brows. Oxen rested in the shade. Even the horses seemed grateful for a short break. The castle kitchen became wonderfully busy once again. A great pot of pottage simmered above the fire. Today it contained barley, onions, cabbage, beans, and a small amount of salted bacon that flavored the entire meal. The smell filled every corner of the kitchen. Rich, earthy, comforting. Beside the fire, fresh loaves of bread cooled upon wooden racks. One young servant resisted the temptation to touch the crust. The cook noticed anyway. She smiled. Wait until they're ready. Good bread, she insisted, deserved patience. Large wooden trenchers were arranged along the tables. In many households, thick slices of stale bread served as plates. They absorbed juices from stews and roasted meats. Afterward, they might be eaten, fed to animals, or given to those in need. Nothing useful was wasted. As preparations continued, sunlight streamed through the narrow windows of the great hall. Tiny dust particles floated lazily through the golden beams. The great room seemed peaceful despite the quiet activity. Servants moved confidently. No one shouted. Everyone understood their task. That silent understanding had been built over years of working together. The castle functioned because hundreds of ordinary people trusted one another. Outside, a gentle wind stirred the colorful banners above the towers. Their embroidered lions and crosses caught the sunlight before settling once more. Beyond the walls, life continued exactly as it had for generations. Shepherds watched their flocks. Millers ground grain beside slow-moving rivers. Children gathered firewood. Women tended gardens. Blacksmiths repaired plows. Fishermen checked their nets. The great events recorded by chroniclers touched only a small part of medieval life. Most people experienced days like this one. Peaceful, predictable, filled with quiet work beneath an open sky. And perhaps that is why these ordinary moments feel so comforting. They remind us that, across hundreds of years, most people hoped for the same simple things. A warm meal, a safe home, honest work, good neighbors, and another peaceful day beneath the summer sun. The noon meal was almost ready. Soon, the great hall would fill with the familiar sounds of wooden bowls, quiet conversation, and the comforting aroma of freshly baked bread, as another calm chapter in the life of the castle gently unfolded. The chapel bell rang 12 slow notes. Its sound drifted gently over the castle walls, across the vegetable gardens, over the stables, and into the surrounding fields where farmers paused for only a brief moment before returning to their work. The midday meal was about to begin. Unlike many families today, medieval households usually treated the noon meal as the largest meal of the day. There was practical wisdom behind the tradition. Most physical labor happened while the sun was high. A generous meal at midday provided the strength needed to finish the afternoon's work. As you entered the great hall, warm sunlight poured through the tall, narrow windows. The rays fell across the long oak tables, making tiny flecks of dust sparkle like golden stars. The room smelled wonderful. Fresh bread, boiled barley, wood smoke, roasted onions, a hint of rosemary, and somewhere beneath it all, the comforting scent of the great oak beams that had watched over the hall for generations. Before anyone sat down, the tables were carefully prepared. You helped place wooden trenchers at each seat. Simple wooden cups stood beside them. A clay salt cellar rested near the center of the table. Salt was precious, not quite as rare as pepper or saffron, but valuable enough that every grain mattered. Most of England's salt came from coastal saltworks or inland brine springs, and transporting it required time and labor. Without salt, preserving meat for winter would have been nearly impossible. In many ways, salt quietly supported medieval civilization. The servants worked together almost without speaking. Each person knew exactly where every cup belonged, where every loaf should be placed, where each pitcher of ale would be needed. Experience had turned countless small movements into habit. There was a quiet beauty in that rhythm. No one rushed. No one hesitated. Everything simply flowed. Soon the steward entered the hall. He glanced around the room with practiced eyes. A missing spoon, A crooked bench, a candle that needed trimming. He noticed details that others overlooked. Running a castle required constant attention to small things. Large problems often began as tiny ones. The first guests entered quietly. Not kings, not famous nobles, only the familiar faces who lived and worked within these walls. Some wore fine wool cloaks. Others wore plain linen tunics patched at the elbows. Status could often be seen in clothing, but everyone shared the same roof. Everyone depended on the same harvest. Everyone hoped for good weather. The cook carried the great pot of pottage with the help of 2 assistants. Steam rose into the air like morning mist over a quiet river. The thick stew shimmered gently. Barley, leeks, carrots, cabbage, beans, onions, a few small pieces of salted pork. Nothing extravagant, yet nourishing, wholesome, exactly the kind of meal that had sustained generations. You filled each bowl carefully. No measuring cups, only practiced judgment. Enough for everyone. Waste was avoided whenever possible. Food represented months of labor. Seeds planted in spring. Fields weeded through summer. Harvest gathered before autumn rains. Grain milled through patient effort. Every spoonful carried the work of many hands. Fresh bread followed. The crust crackled softly as each loaf was broken apart. Warm steam escaped into the hall. Even after centuries, there is something deeply comforting about the smell of fresh bread. Perhaps because humans have shared that simple pleasure for thousands of years. A small wheel of cheese appeared next. Firm, creamy, made from the milk of cows that grazed peacefully beyond the castle walls. Cheese was practical. It lasted far longer than fresh milk and provided valuable nourishment during every season. Nearby, a young page poured weak ale into wooden cups. Modern visitors are often surprised to learn how common ale was. The water itself was not always dangerous, but local quality varied greatly. Brewing often produced a drink that was more reliable for daily consumption. The ale served with ordinary meals contained very little alcohol. It refreshed more than it intoxicated. As the meal continued, quiet conversation filled the hall. Nothing dramatic. Someone spoke about repairing a fence near the orchard. Another wondered whether rain might arrive before the end of the week. The blacksmith laughed gently after telling a story about a stubborn mule that had refused to wear its new horseshoes. Laughter spread slowly around the table. Not loud, just enough to brighten the room. History often focuses on kings making speeches. Ordinary people spent far more time discussing weather, crops, animals, and neighbors. And perhaps that is exactly what made life feel familiar. Outside, the castle dogs rested beneath the shade of a large oak tree. They had spent the morning following stable hands and watching strangers enter through the gate. Now they slept peacefully, one ear always alert for unusual sounds. Dogs served many purposes. They guarded livestock, warned of approaching visitors, accompanied hunters, and much like today, offered loyal companionship. One old hound dreamed quietly. His paws twitched as though he were chasing rabbits through an endless green meadow. Even dreams, it seemed, had changed very little across the centuries. After the meal, nothing was hurried. People remained seated for a few moments. Bread was finished. The last of the pottage disappeared. Wooden cups were emptied. Then one by one, everyone rose. The servants immediately began clearing the tables. Leftover bread was carefully collected. Nothing edible would be discarded. Wooden bowls were stacked neatly. The heavy cooking pot returned to the kitchen. Outside, the afternoon sun climbed a little higher into the clear blue sky. A pair of swallows circled above the courtyard. Somewhere beyond the walls, church bells from a distant village answered the castle bell with faint echoes carried on the warm breeze. For a brief moment, you stood beside the doorway of the great hall. You looked across the peaceful courtyard. The stable, the well, the gardens, the workshops. Nothing extraordinary was happening. No great battle. No royal procession. No historic ceremony. Only another ordinary afternoon in medieval England. And perhaps that is the greatest secret hidden inside history. Most of the past was not made of extraordinary moments. It was made of ordinary afternoons exactly like this one, where quiet work, shared meals, warm bread, and peaceful conversation carried the world gently forward, one day at a time. After the midday meal, the castle grew quieter once again. Not silent, simply softer. The cheerful conversation that had filled the great hall slowly faded as everyone returned to their daily responsibilities. Wooden bowls disappeared into the kitchens. Benches were pushed neatly beneath the long tables. A few crumbs remained on the oak floor, and within moments, the castle's chickens wandered hopefully nearby, searching for forgotten pieces. Almost nothing remained unused. Even crumbs found a purpose. Outside, the summer sun stood high above the towers. The shadows had become short. Warm light covered the limestone walls, making them appear almost golden instead of gray. If someone had looked at the castle from a distant hill, it might have seemed perfectly peaceful. And on most days, it truly was. History often remembers castles because of sieges. Yet most castles spent the vast majority of their lives at peace. Years could pass without a single battle. Instead, they served as homes, workplaces, centers of local government, and places where ordinary people quietly lived their lives. You picked up a wooden rake and walked toward the kitchen garden. The gardeners had already harvested onions that morning. Now the soil needed to be loosened before another planting. The earth felt warm beneath your hands. Rich, dark, full of life. Every handful contained countless tiny creatures that medieval people never knew existed. They could not see earthworms improving the soil beneath the surface. They knew only that healthy earth produced healthy crops. And that knowledge was enough. Nearby, rows of cabbages stretched neatly across the garden. Some were nearly ready for harvest. Others had only recently begun to grow. The gardener believed that no patch of ground should remain empty for long. Whenever one crop was harvested, another quickly took its place. Space inside the castle walls was precious. Every corner had to earn its keep. A gentle breeze carried the scent of flowering herbs across the garden. The lavender hummed quietly with busy bees. Tiny butterflies drifted from blossom to blossom, without any concern for the work taking place around them. Dragonflies skimmed across the surface of a small pond near the orchard. The pond collected rainwater during wet months. Frogs lived happily among the reeds. They sang loudly on warm evenings after rain. Children often tried to catch them. They almost never succeeded. The gardener laughed whenever he watched. Frogs, he liked to say, always know when little hands are coming. Whether that was true or not hardly mattered. Some stories survived because they made people smile. Beyond the gardens, several sheep grazed peacefully in a nearby meadow. Their thick wool represented one of England's greatest sources of wealth. For centuries, English wool had been famous throughout Europe. Merchants carried it across the sea to skilled weavers in distant towns. A healthy flock meant warm clothing, profitable trade, and steady income. The shepherd watched carefully. Not because wolves were common here, but because sheep had a remarkable talent for wandering exactly where they should not. He knew each animal almost as well as the stable master knew his horses. The afternoon warmth encouraged many workers to slow their pace slightly. Not because they were lazy, because experience had taught them that steady work lasted longer than hurried work. A tired worker made mistakes. A patient worker finished the day. Inside the cool shade of the castle workshop, a basket maker continued weaving willow branches. The fresh willow bent easily beneath skilled hands. Over, under, around, again. The pattern repeated endlessly. A single basket might carry vegetables for years before finally wearing out. Then it could often be repaired. When repair became impossible, the old willow eventually returned to the soil. Almost every object in medieval life began in nature, and eventually returned there. Across the courtyard, a young apprentice carefully learned his trade beneath the watchful eyes of an experienced carpenter. The master rarely raised his voice. Instead, he demonstrated each movement slowly. How to hold the chisel, how to follow the grain of the wood, how to sharpen a blade until it could shave the finest curl from a plank of oak. Apprenticeships often lasted 7 years or more. There were no classrooms, no printed textbooks. Knowledge passed directly from one pair of hands to another. One generation quietly teaching the next. You paused beside the well to draw another bucket of water. The stone rim felt pleasantly cool despite the afternoon heat. Looking down, you could see only darkness. Then far below, a faint reflection of sunlight shimmered upon the water. The well had served the castle faithfully for decades, perhaps even centuries. Countless hands had pulled this same rope. Countless shoulders had carried these same heavy buckets. History leaves behind monuments, but it also leaves behind worn stone, polished smooth by ordinary people simply doing their work. A pair of doves landed upon the edge of the chapel roof. They cooed softly to one another before flying toward the orchard. Birds cared little for castles or kingdoms. To them, the towers were simply tall cliffs. The gardens offered seeds. The rooftops provided safe places to nest. Nature quietly adapted to human life. As the afternoon stretched onward, a cool breeze arrived from the west. Dark clouds gathered faintly along the distant horizon. Not storm clouds, just enough to promise a little shade before evening. Several farmers looked upward with quiet approval. A little rain tomorrow would help the barley. Too much rain would flatten it. Living close to the land meant constantly watching the sky. Clouds often carried tomorrow's news. The castle bell rang once more. Its familiar sound drifted gently through the warm afternoon air. No one seemed surprised. The bell had marked the passing hours for as long as anyone could remember. Children barely noticed it anymore. The older servant smiled. Its steady rhythm reminded them that another peaceful day continued exactly as it should. The sun slowly began its long journey toward the western hills. The light softened almost too gradually to notice. Golden colors returned to the stone walls. The busy afternoon slowly prepared to become another quiet evening. And somewhere deep within the castle, fresh bread was already rising once again, ready to greet another dawn. The afternoon slowly leaned toward evening. The sunlight that had seemed bright and endless only a short while ago now turned softer, spreading across the castle walls like warm honey. The towers cast longer shadows with every passing minute. The courtyard, busy since before sunrise, finally began to breathe a little more slowly. You carried a wooden basket toward the castle's small orchard. This was one of the quietest places within the walls. Even on the busiest days, the orchard seemed untouched by hurry. Apple trees stood in careful rows, their branches gently swaying in the afternoon breeze. Some apples were still small and green. Others had already begun showing faint hints of red. The gardener believed that every tree deserved attention, whether it carried 10 apples or 100. He moved patiently from one tree to the next, examining leaves for signs of disease or hungry insects. Without modern sprays or chemical fertilizers, healthy trees depended almost entirely upon careful observation. Years of experience had trained his eyes. He could often notice a problem before anyone else. Nearby stood several beehives made from woven straw. These dome-shaped hives, called skeps, looked surprisingly simple. Bees entered and left through tiny openings near the bottom, completely absorbed in their endless work. The gentle hum surrounded the orchard, not loud, not distracting, only peaceful. Medieval beekeepers valued bees for many reasons. Honey was the most obvious. Long before refined sugar became common, honey sweetened food, preserved fruit, and flavored drinks. But bees also produced beeswax. Unlike tallow candles, beeswax candles burned with a cleaner flame and a pleasant scent. They were especially prized in churches and chapels. The beekeeper watched the insects with quiet respect. He knew that patience mattered. A hive could not be rushed. Nature worked according to its own calendar. You paused beside one of the apple trees. A robin landed on a nearby branch, cocking its head curiously before hopping closer. It seemed entirely unafraid. Perhaps generations of birds had grown accustomed to gardeners who meant them no harm. The robin soon flew away, disappearing into the hedgerow beyond the orchard. The hedges surrounding the castle served several purposes. They marked boundaries, sheltered wildlife, protected young plants from strong winds. They also supplied berries, nuts, and useful branches for weaving baskets or repairing fences. Nothing in the landscape existed without purpose. Even wild places quietly contributed to daily life. As you returned toward the courtyard, you noticed the castle mason inspecting part of the outer wall. Stone buildings lasted a very long time, but only if people cared for them. Small cracks appeared over the years. Winter frost widened them. Rain slowly washed away mortar. Tiny repairs completed today prevented much larger repairs tomorrow. The mason carried only a few simple tools: a hammer, several chisels, a plumb line, a wooden level. Centuries before laser measuring devices, builders relied upon strings, weights, and astonishing skill. Many medieval craftsmen produced work so precise that parts of it still stand today. Inside the workshop, the cooper had nearly finished a large barrel. He carefully heated thin iron hoops over a small fire. As the hot metal expanded, it slipped easily around the oak staves. Later, as the iron cooled, it would shrink tightly into place, holding the entire barrel together. It was an elegant solution, simple, reliable, beautiful in its own practical way. The smell of warm oak mixed gently with smoke from the nearby forge. The blacksmith was repairing a farmer's plowshare. A sharp plow made the work of oxen much easier. Better plowing often meant better harvests. Better harvests meant healthier families. A single well-made piece of iron could quietly improve the lives of hundreds of people over many years. Children's laughter drifted across the courtyard. A group of young boys had found smooth stones beside the path and were trying to skip them across a shallow pond. Most of the stones sank immediately. One bounced twice before disappearing beneath the surface. The boys celebrated as though they had achieved something extraordinary. Perhaps they had. Joy rarely depended upon expensive possessions. It often appeared in the simplest moments. Nearby, two young girls gathered wildflowers growing beside the castle wall. They carefully arranged daisies, buttercups, and cornflowers into tiny bouquets. No one had instructed them to do so. Beauty needed no explanation. The flowers would probably wilt before tomorrow. That did not make them any less lovely today. The castle priest walked slowly through the garden carrying a small handwritten book. He paused now and then beneath the shade of a tree to read quietly. Books remained precious enough that they were treated with great care, clean hands, dry weather, gentle pages. Each manuscript represented months of patient work. Even turning a page felt almost ceremonial. The priest looked up for a moment and smiled as a light breeze rustled the leaves overhead. Perhaps he appreciated the peaceful afternoon as much as anyone else. Beyond the castle walls, farmers continued bringing in bundles of hay. Wooden wagons creaked softly beneath their heavy loads. Teams of oxen moved at their usual patient pace. Oxen were slower than horses, but they were strong, steady, and surprisingly economical to keep. For many farming families, they remained the preferred choice for heavy work. The smell of fresh-cut hay drifted across the fields, warm, sweet, almost comforting. It mixed with the scent of sun-warmed grass and distant wood smoke. Modern air often carries the smell of gasoline or asphalt. A medieval summer afternoon smelled almost entirely of the natural world. As the shadows lengthened, swallows returned to their nests beneath the stable roof. One by one, they disappeared beneath the wooden beams. The sky slowly shifted from brilliant blue to softer shades of gold. The castle itself seemed to grow quieter with every passing minute. Another ordinary afternoon was gently coming to an end. No great battle had been fought. No royal decree had arrived. No famous visitor had crossed the drawbridge. Yet the day had been full. Bread had been baked, animals cared for, gardens tended. Tools repaired, children had laughed, neighbors had worked side by side. The seasons had quietly continued their endless cycle. And perhaps that was the truest story of medieval life. Not the rare moments that filled chronicles, but the countless peaceful afternoons that filled ordinary lives, one gentle hour after another, beneath the timeless stone walls of an English castle. The golden afternoon slowly began to fade. Sunlight poured across the western side of the castle, painting the ancient stone with warm shades of amber and soft gold. For a little while, even the oldest walls looked almost new. This quiet hour was one of your favorites. The busiest work of the day was nearly finished, but evening had not quite arrived. There was still time to enjoy the peaceful rhythm of the castle before the shadows grew long. You picked up 2 empty wicker baskets and made your way toward the vegetable garden once again. The narrow path curved gently between beds of herbs and rows of vegetables. The soil still held the warmth of the afternoon sun. A butterfly floated lazily from one lavender flower to another, never seeming to hurry. It reminded you of something the old gardener often said. The earth is never in a race. He had worked these gardens for more than 40 years. His hands were rough from digging and planting. His boots had been repaired so many times that very little of the original leather remained. Yet he knew every corner of the garden. He could tell where the first strawberries would appear each spring. He remembered which apple tree always blossomed a few days earlier than the others. He even recognized the songs of the birds that nested near the herb beds. To him, the garden was not simply a place where food was grown. It was an old friend. You knelt beside a row of broad beans. Their green pods hung heavily from the stems. One by one, you picked them carefully, placing each into the basket without bruising the plants. Nearby, rows of onions waited to be harvested. Their long green leaves bent gently in the breeze. Some would be eaten fresh. Others would be braided together and hung from wooden beams inside the pantry, where they could last well into the winter months. Nothing in the garden existed by accident. Every plant had earned its place. Cabbages provided dependable food during cold seasons. Leeks flavored soups almost every week. Parsley brightened simple meals. Sage seasoned roasted meats. Mint freshened the breath after eating. Even flowers had practical uses. Calendula petals colored butter. Chamomile became soothing tea. Lavender helped scent linen stored in wooden chests. The medieval garden was both kitchen and pharmacy. As you walked toward the orchard, you noticed several squirrels racing along the branches of a large oak tree. One paused just long enough to look directly at you before disappearing into the leaves. The old carpenter claimed squirrels always knew where every acorn was hidden. Whether that was true hardly mattered. The little creatures certainly behaved as though they owned the forest. Beyond the orchard, The castle pond reflected the sky like polished glass. A pair of ducks drifted slowly across the water. Dragonflies skimmed the surface, their wings catching the sunlight for just a moment before vanishing again. Near the edge of the pond, reeds swayed softly in the breeze. Hidden among them, frogs waited patiently for insects to wander too close. The pond served many purposes. It collected rainwater. It attracted useful wildlife. It provided fish on occasion. And perhaps most importantly, it offered a place of remarkable peace. Many servants paused there whenever they found a spare minute. Not because they were avoiding work, simply because quiet places nourish tired minds. You sat on a smooth stone beside the water for only a few moments. The castle bells had not yet rung. No one was calling your name. The breeze carried only natural sounds. Bird song, rustling leaves, the gentle splash of ducks moving through the water. For a brief moment, it felt as though time itself had slowed. Perhaps that was always the greatest luxury available in the Middle Ages. Not wealth, not jewels, not silk clothing, but moments of calm beneath an open sky. As you returned toward the castle, you passed the small herb drying house. Bundles of rosemary hung upside down from wooden rafters. Nearby were sage, thyme, mint, fennel, and lavender. The room smelled wonderful, rich with earthy fragrances. The herbs would dry slowly over several weeks before being stored in cloth bags or pottery jars. Even during winter, their scents would remind people of warm summer days. The castle kitchen was busy again, not with preparing a grand feast, simply with making the evening meal. A large loaf of bread rested upon the wooden table, cooling beside several smaller loaves. The cook tasted a pot of vegetable broth with a carved wooden spoon. She nodded quietly. A little more time. A pinch of salt. Nothing more. Good food did not always require expensive ingredients. It required care. Near the ovens, the baker brushed loose flour from his apron. He had already been working since before sunrise. Tomorrow's dough was resting beneath linen cloths. Today's bread was finished. His work never truly ended. It simply moved from one day into the next. The blacksmith's forge had finally grown quiet. The bright orange glow faded slowly beneath a layer of ash. His hammer rested upon the anvil, exactly where it would be waiting tomorrow morning. Nearby, the carpenter swept wood shavings into a neat pile. The scent of fresh-cut oak lingered pleasantly in the cool evening air. One by one, the sounds of labor faded across the castle. The stable doors were closed. The chickens found their favorite places to roost. The sheep settled peacefully beyond the walls. Even the swallows returned to their nests beneath the eaves. As the first evening star appeared above the western horizon, the castle seemed to exhale. Another ordinary day had nearly reached its end. No great victory had been celebrated. No famous visitor had arrived. No page of history would mention this peaceful afternoon. Yet for the people who lived within these walls, this day had mattered. The gardens had grown. The bread had risen. The tools had been repaired. The children had laughed. The animals had been fed. And life had quietly moved forward, exactly as it had for generations. As twilight settled gently over the castle, the ancient stones glowed softly beneath the fading light. Candles would soon be lit. The great gates would close once more. And another calm medieval evening was about to begin, beneath a sky filled with countless stars that watched silently over England, just as they had for centuries before, and would for centuries still to come. Twilight arrived so quietly that no one could say exactly when the day had ended. One moment, the castle courtyard still glowed, beneath the warm light of the setting sun. The next, the shadows had gently blended together until the stone walls appeared blue-gray beneath the evening sky. A cool breeze drifted through the open gatehouse before the great wooden doors were closed for the night. It carried the scent of wild grass, damp earth, and distant wood smoke from cottages scattered across the valley. You stood for a moment near the gate and looked toward the countryside. Farmers were making their final journey home. A small wagon rolled slowly along the winding road, its wooden wheels creaking softly over the uneven ground. Behind it walked two oxen, patient as ever. They had spent the entire day pulling a plow through heavy soil. Now they lowered their heads, content simply to return to the familiar comfort of the barn. The gatekeeper gave each traveler a friendly nod before securing the heavy doors. Closing the gates each evening was more than a routine. It marked the end of the working day. Once the thick oak beams were lowered into place, the castle became a quiet little world of its own. Outside lay forests, rivers, villages, and open fields. Inside remained warmth, shelter, and familiar faces. The sound of the great locking beam echoed through the courtyard. It was a deep, reassuring sound. Many generations had fallen asleep after hearing it. As darkness slowly settled, candles began appearing throughout the castle. One flame in the kitchen, another beside the steward's writing desk, two more inside the chapel. The light they produced was gentle and golden. It did not banish the darkness completely. Instead, it shared the space with it. Corners of the hall remained softly shaded. Wooden beams disappeared into shadow above. The flickering light made every room feel calm and welcoming. In the kitchen, preparations for tomorrow had already begun. The cook carefully sorted dried peas into a wooden bowl. Another servant measured barley from a large storage sack. A young helper peeled onions while trying very hard not to rub tired eyes. Tomorrow's meals depended upon tonight's planning. Nothing happened by accident. The pantry itself was one of the quiet treasures of the castle. Rows of shelves held clay jars, wooden barrels, linen sacks, and woven baskets. Bundles of garlic hung from the rafters beside strings of onions. Dried apples rested in shallow wooden trays. Small bags of herbs waited patiently for winter soups and stews. Even after a busy harvest, careful management remained essential. A full pantry in autumn did not guarantee a full pantry in February. The steward understood this better than anyone. He checked supplies almost every evening, not because he expected disaster, because careful habits prevented it. Nearby, the castle brewer inspected several large barrels of ale. Brewing required remarkable attention. Water, malted grain, yeast, time, each step mattered. Most everyday ale was mild and nourishing rather than strong. It formed an ordinary part of daily life for servants and nobles alike. The brewer dipped a small wooden cup into one barrel. He tasted it thoughtfully, then smiled. This batch, he decided, had turned out especially well. Outside, the stable had become wonderfully peaceful. The horses stood quietly inside their stalls. Some chewed hay with slow, steady movements. Others rested one hind leg, perfectly relaxed. The stable lantern cast long shadows across the straw-covered floor. You enjoyed visiting the horses before bed. There was something calming about their quiet confidence. They asked for very little. Fresh water, good food, gentle care. In return, they carried people and goods across the countryside day after day. One old chestnut horse lifted his head as you approached. He recognized the familiar sound of your footsteps. You scratched gently behind his ears. He closed his eyes for a brief moment. Neither of you seemed in any hurry. the stable cat appeared silently from behind a stack of hay. She moved with effortless grace. Her nightly hunt had already begun. A tiny mouse probably had no idea she was watching. The stable master often joked that the cats worked the night shift. No one argued with him. Far above, the sky had grown wonderfully clear. The first stars appeared one by one. Then dozens. Then hundreds. Soon the entire sky shimmered with light. Without towns glowing on the horizon, the heavens looked astonishingly bright. The broad ribbon of the Milky Way stretched from one side of the sky to the other. Many people believed the stars reflected divine order. Others simply admired their beauty. Either way, they inspired quiet wonder. Near the chapel, a novice carefully extinguished several candles after evening prayers. He used a small metal snuffer rather than blowing them out. This prevented hot wax from splattering and helped preserve the wick. Even tiny details mattered. Candles were valuable. Bees had worked hard to produce the wax. The beekeeper had worked hard to collect it. The candle maker had worked hard to shape it. Nothing was treated carelessly. Inside the great hall, the fire burned lower now. Large oak logs had settled into glowing embers. The warmth still reached every corner of the room, though the bright flames of earlier had disappeared. Several servants sat quietly mending clothing. One carefully patched the elbow of a linen shirt. Another reinforced the sole of a leather shoe with thick thread. Repairing clothes was an ordinary evening task. A single garment often lasted many years because people cared for it patiently. Every stitch extended its life. Every patch told part of its story. The oldest servant in the hall began quietly telling a story while his hands continued working. Not a tale of dragons or magic, simply a memory from his own childhood. He remembered an especially snowy winter when the river had frozen solid. He described children sliding across the ice while adults worried about the coming spring. The younger servants listened politely. Perhaps they had heard the story before. That hardly mattered. Good stories were meant to be shared again and again, just as songs became richer with each familiar verse. As the evening grew later, conversations became softer. One by one, candles were extinguished. The castle slowly prepared itself for another peaceful night. Tomorrow would bring another sunrise, another loaf of bread, another bucket drawn from the well, another quiet day beneath ancient stone walls. And somewhere high above the sleeping castle, the stars continued their silent journey across the sky, watching over a world that asked for nothing more than peace, honest work, and the promise of another dawn. By the time the last conversation faded into silence, the castle belonged to the night once more. The great fire in the hall had settled into a bed of glowing embers. Every now and then, a small piece of oak shifted with a gentle crack, sending a tiny shower of sparks upward before they disappeared into the wide stone chimney. The warmth remained, even though the flames had grown quiet. The air smelled faintly of wood smoke, beeswax, and freshly baked bread that still rested in the pantry. For most of the people inside the castle, the day had ended. The steward had finished his records. The cook had covered tomorrow's dough with clean linen. The blacksmith's forge had cooled. The stable doors had been secured. Only a handful of people remained awake. The watchman walked slowly along the top of the curtain wall. His boots made a soft, familiar sound against the worn stone. Step, step, step. He carried a lantern with horn panels instead of glass. Glass large enough for lanterns remained costly, and thin slices of polished animal horn allowed light to pass while protecting the small flame from the wind. The lantern swayed gently with each step. Its golden circle of light moved across the ancient stones. Every few moments, the watchman stopped. He listened carefully, not because he expected danger every night, but because listening had become a habit. Far below, the river flowed quietly through the valley. Its gentle current had carved the landscape long before the first stone of the castle had ever been laid. Water had shaped kingdoms more faithfully than armies ever could. Villages grew beside rivers. Mills depended upon them. Fish filled their waters. Merchants followed them. Children learned to swim in them during warm summers. The river never hurried. It simply continued toward the sea, exactly as it always had. A cool mist began forming above the water. It drifted slowly across the meadows until the lower fields looked almost dreamlike beneath the moonlight. The moon itself had climbed high into the sky. Its pale light reflected from the castle walls, making the stone appear almost silver. The banners hanging from the towers barely moved. The evening breeze had become little more than a whisper. Beyond the walls, a barn owl glided silently across the fields. Unlike many birds, its feathers allowed it to fly with remarkable quietness. Modern scientists have discovered that the soft edges of owl feathers help reduce noise during flight. 800 years ago, people did not know the science behind it. They simply marveled at how silently an owl could appear. The watchman smiled as the bird disappeared into the darkness. He had seen the same owl many evenings before. The countryside had its own familiar residents. Inside the stable, everything remained peaceful. The horses slept standing up, occasionally shifting their weight from one leg to another. This remarkable habit allowed them to rest, while remaining ready to move if necessary. Only during deeper sleep would they sometimes lie down upon the straw. One young colt dreamed gently. Its ears twitched. One foreleg moved slightly. Perhaps it imagined running across a wide green meadow beneath the summer sun. Animals, like people, carried their own quiet mysteries. The stable cat completed another successful patrol. She emerged proudly from the shadows, clearly pleased with herself. The stable master would almost certainly discover one less mouse in the morning. Without ever asking for praise, she had quietly protected another portion of the castle's grain. Near the kitchen, several barrels collected rainwater from the roof through wooden gutters. Although no rain had fallen that evening, the barrels stood ready. People in the Middle Ages understood the value of preparation. A full rain barrel after a storm could save many trips to the well. Simple ideas often made difficult lives a little easier. Inside the pantry, rows of shelves rested quietly in the darkness. Barrels of oats, sacks of barley, bundles of dried herbs, clay jars of honey, strings of onions. Everything waited patiently for tomorrow. Food storage required more than careful harvesting. It demanded discipline. The temptation to consume too much during times of abundance had to be resisted. Wise stewards always thought several months ahead. Outside the chapel, a small stone bench overlooked the inner garden. You sat there for a few peaceful moments before returning to bed. The garden looked entirely different beneath the moon. The white flowers almost seemed to glow. The lavender moved gently in the cool night air. Some flowers released an even stronger fragrance after sunset. Night carried scents differently than day. The world felt quieter, slower, almost timeless. You looked upward. The stars seemed endless. Without electric lights, people during the Middle Ages lived beneath one of the most magnificent night skies in human history. The pale ribbon of the Milky Way stretched overhead with astonishing clarity. Many travelers learned directions from the stars. Farmers noticed how the changing constellations marked the passing seasons. Monks recorded unusual celestial events in handwritten chronicles. The sky served as both calendar and compass. Yet on peaceful nights like this, it also offered simple comfort. It reminded everyone that tomorrow would come, that the seasons would continue, that spring would follow winter, that sunrise always returned. As you quietly stood from the stone bench, the chapel bell marked another passing hour. Its gentle note drifted over the sleeping castle before fading into the valley below. Nothing answered. No voices. No wagons. Only the soft chirping of crickets hidden among the tall grass. The world seemed perfectly content to rest. You returned to your small sleeping chamber. The straw mattress felt familiar after another long day. The coarse wool blanket carried the faint scent of lavender from the herbs stored nearby. The wooden shutters had been closed, leaving only a narrow beam of moonlight slipping through a tiny gap. You lay down. The castle around you had become completely still. Somewhere in the distance, the watchman continued his slow walk along the walls. The fire in the great hall glowed softly beneath its blanket of ash. The horses rested. The garden slept beneath the moon. The river continued its endless journey toward the sea. And wrapped in the comforting silence of an ordinary medieval night, you slowly drifted into a peaceful sleep, while history itself moved quietly onward. One calm night, one gentle sunrise, and one forgotten day at a time. Before the sun had even begun to color the eastern sky, the castle rested in the quietest hour of the day. This was the hour that few people ever remembered. The hour between yesterday and tomorrow. The hour when the stars still ruled the sky, yet dawn had already begun its slow approach beyond the distant hills. The air felt cool against your face. A light mist rested over the valley below the castle, softening every tree, every field, and every winding path into gentle shades of gray. From the top of the curtain wall, the countryside looked almost endless. The forests were silent. The river flowed without a sound loud enough to reach the towers. Even the birds had not yet begun their morning chorus. It was as if the entire kingdom had paused for one deep, peaceful breath. The night watchman reached the end of his final round. For nearly 12 hours, he had walked the same familiar path. Past the gatehouse, along the battlements, around the keep, beside the chapel, across the inner courtyard. Again and again. His work was repetitive, but repetition often brought comfort. Every stone beneath his boots was familiar. He knew which stair creaked, which section of wall caught the strongest wind, which corner usually welcomed the first rays of morning sunlight. A lifetime spent in one place teaches a person countless small details. Details that never appear in history books. He stopped beside the eastern tower and looked toward the horizon. There it was, the faintest silver line. Another sunrise was on its way. Long before clocks became common, people understood time by observing the sky. The changing color of dawn, the position of the moon, the length of shadows, the songs of birds. Nature quietly announced every hour. As the first hint of light spread across the valley, a single blackbird began to sing. Its clear notes floated through the cool morning air. Within minutes, another answered. Then another. Soon the hedgerows seemed alive with gentle music. Robins, thrushes, finches, wrens. Each species greeted the morning in its own way. Modern scientists call this the dawn chorus. People in the Middle Ages simply accepted it as another beautiful part of everyday life. You stirred beneath your blanket, not because someone called your name, but because your body had grown accustomed to waking with the light. For most medieval people, the sun remained the world's most reliable clock. Artificial light was precious. Daylight was free. Life naturally followed its rhythm. You sat quietly for a moment before standing. The stone floor still felt cool beneath your boots. Your room was simple. The same wooden chest. The same wool blanket. The same peg on the wall where your cloak hung drying after yesterday's work. Nothing had changed overnight. There was comfort in that. Outside, the kitchen chimney released its first thin ribbon of smoke. Someone had already awakened the fire. The smell of burning oak drifted gently across the courtyard. Soon fresh bread would begin another journey from flour to loaf. Nearby, the stable master opened the doors just wide enough to let in the fresh morning air. The horses greeted the new day with soft nickers. One stretched its neck toward the sunlight now reaching across the yard. Another shook its mane before calmly returning to its hay. Morning routines belonged to everyone, even the animals. The castle well reflected the brightening sky. Looking into its still water, you could see the first pale colors of dawn mirrored far below. The rope felt slightly damp from the cool night air as you lowered the wooden bucket. The splash echoed softly. Moments later, fresh water shimmered in the morning light. Countless mornings had begun exactly this way. Countless more still lay ahead. Near the garden gate, the old gardener had already begun his work. He believed the garden looked its most beautiful before sunrise. Tiny drops of dew rested upon every cabbage leaf. Spider webs stretched between the herbs like delicate silver lace. Each thread held dozens of sparkling droplets. The entire garden seemed covered with tiny diamonds. Within an hour, the sun would dry them away. The gardener always paused for a moment before beginning. He believed beautiful things deserved to be noticed. Not admired for long. Simply noticed. He bent down beside a row of thyme. Rubbing a few leaves gently between his fingers, released a warm, earthy fragrance into the cool morning air. The smell lingered pleasantly. Nearby, mint carried its fresh, clean scent. Lavender added soft floral notes. The entire garden seemed to awaken one aroma at a time. In the orchard, a gentle breeze moved through the apple trees. Several ripe apples had fallen during the night. You gathered them carefully into a basket. No fruit was wasted if it could still be eaten. Those with small bruises might become cider. Others could be baked into simple tarts or dried for the colder months. The beekeeper approached his straw skeps quietly. The bees were already beginning their morning flights. Thousands of tiny workers left the hive in every direction, each searching for flowers rich with nectar. No one directed them. No one gave orders. Yet together, they formed one of nature's most remarkable communities. Watching them reminded you of the castle itself. Every person had a task. Every task mattered. No single individual could keep the castle alive alone. But together, the oven stayed warm. The gardens flourished. The horses remained healthy. The walls stood strong. The bread was baked. The candles were made. The wells were kept clean. History often celebrates extraordinary people. Daily life depended upon ordinary ones. The first rays of sunlight finally reached the highest tower. The gray stone slowly turned gold. Swallows darted from beneath the stable roof, beginning another busy day of chasing insects through the clear morning sky. The castle had awakened once again. Not with excitement, not with urgency, but with the same calm rhythm that had guided generations before you. Another peaceful day had begun. Another page in the quiet story of forgotten lives. Another sunrise over ancient England, where ordinary people quietly built history, one loaf of bread, one bucket of water, and one gentle morning at a time. The morning unfolded at its own gentle pace. The sun had now climbed above the eastern hills, and its light spilled across the castle courtyard in long golden ribbons. Tiny drops of dew still clung to the grass in the shaded corners, while the open pathways had already begun to dry beneath the growing warmth. This was one of the quiet miracles of medieval life. The same sunrise that warmed the highest tower also reached the smallest flower growing between two stones. Nature made very few distinctions. You walked slowly toward the bakehouse, following the comforting scent of fresh bread. Long before you reached the heavy wooden door, you could hear the quiet rhythm inside. The baker's wooden peel scraped gently across the stone floor of the great oven. The crackle of burning oak echoed softly beneath the thick brick arch. Loaves rested in neat rows, their rounded tops slowly turning a beautiful golden brown. The baker stood back for a moment and smiled. He never hurried this part. Bread could not be persuaded to bake faster. The fire decided the pace. The flour decided the texture. The weather even played its part. On damp mornings, the dough behaved differently than it did during dry summer afternoons. Without modern thermometers or timers, every loaf depended upon careful observation. The baker judged the heat by holding his hand near the oven's opening. He listened to the gentle crackle of the crust. He watched the color change little by little. These skills had taken years to learn. No written instructions could fully explain them. Experience became the greatest teacher. Nearby, several young apprentices carried sacks of freshly milled flour into the storeroom. Each sack was surprisingly heavy. The flour had arrived only yesterday from the village mill beside the river. There, a great wooden water wheel had turned steadily from dawn until dusk. The flowing current powered massive millstones, grinding grain into fine flour far more efficiently than hand grinding ever could. Watermills were among the most impressive pieces of medieval engineering. Many had been built generations earlier, yet they continued working faithfully every day. The miller often joked that the river never asked for wages. It simply kept turning the wheel. Beyond the bakehouse, the castle courtyard was slowly filling with familiar sounds. A carpenter's mallet tapped gently against oak. The blacksmith's hammer answered with its steady ring. A woman swept yesterday's dust from the stone steps leading to the great hall. Nearby, two boys carefully stacked freshly split firewood beneath a covered shelter, making sure the logs remained dry for future use. Every task seemed connected to another. Firewood warmed the ovens. The ovens baked the bread. The bread fed the workers. The workers repaired the castle. The castle protected the people. Nothing stood alone. As you crossed the courtyard, you noticed the old well once again. Its stone rim had become smooth after centuries of use. Thousands of hands had rested there. Children too small to draw water on their own. Strong laborers carrying heavy buckets. Travelers grateful for a cool drink after long journeys. Even noble visitors had paused there during warm afternoons. The well served everyone equally. Its quiet generosity never changed. Near the stable, the farrier had arrived to inspect several horses. Although people often think of blacksmiths and farriers as the same trade, many large castles employed specialists. The farrier focused entirely on the health of horses' hooves. He examined each hoof carefully before replacing worn horseshoes. Healthy hooves meant healthy horses. Healthy horses meant reliable travel, successful farming, and safe journeys. He lifted one horse's leg with practiced ease. The animal stood patiently. Trust had been built through years of gentle handling. Nearby, a pair of geese wandered confidently through the courtyard. Unlike the chickens, they carried themselves with remarkable importance. They watched everyone who passed. If a stranger approached, They announced it with loud, unmistakable voices. Some castle guards joked that the geese noticed visitors before the watchmen did. Whether or not that was true, few people ignored a goose determined to make itself heard. The morning breeze carried another pleasant surprise: the fragrance of wild roses blooming beyond the outer wall. Medieval gardens often included roses, not only for beauty but also for practical use. Rose petals flavored syrups. Rose hips provided nourishment during colder months. The flowers themselves reminded people that usefulness and beauty could live side by side. As the sun climbed higher, the steward walked slowly through the storehouses. He carried his familiar wax tablet. Today he counted barrels of oats, bundles of dried herbs, wheels of cheese resting upon wooden shelves, clay jars filled with honey collected from the castle's own hives. Good stewardship required constant attention. A forgotten leak could spoil valuable grain. A loose roof tile might allow rain into the pantry. Small problems rarely remained small if ignored. Outside the walls, the surrounding countryside shimmered beneath the bright summer sky. Farmers guided oxen through fields where barley swayed gently in the breeze. Women gathered herbs from hedgerows. Children chased butterflies through grassy meadows before being called back to help with simple chores. Smoke rose lazily from village chimneys. From this distance, the world appeared perfectly peaceful. And on most days, it truly was. The castle bell rang softly, marking another passing hour. No one seemed surprised. The sound had become woven into daily life. People rarely counted the rings anymore. Their hands simply continued working. The bell reminded everyone that time, like the nearby river, never stopped flowing. As you looked around the courtyard, you realized something that history books rarely mention. Castles were not only places of stone. They were places of rhythm. Every sunrise began with familiar tasks. Every afternoon followed familiar paths. Every evening settled gently into quiet. The walls offered protection, but it was the people, the bakers, gardeners, blacksmiths, stable hands, cooks, carpenters, and countless forgotten servants, who gave the castle its heartbeat. Without them, even the strongest fortress would have been nothing more than silent stone beneath the English sky. The castle had now fully awakened. The gentle quiet of dawn had slowly transformed into the calm rhythm of another working morning. From almost every corner came the sounds of ordinary life. The steady tap of a carpenter's mallet, the distant ring of the blacksmith's hammer, the soft clucking of hens wandering freely across the courtyard, the cheerful chatter of swallows circling above the rooftops. None of these sounds demanded attention. Together, they formed the peaceful melody of a medieval day. You were asked to accompany the steward on one of his regular inspections. Unlike kings or knights, the steward rarely appeared in paintings. Yet few people understood the castle better. He knew how many barrels of grain remained, which roof tiles needed replacing before winter, how much hay had been stored for the horses, which chickens had stopped laying eggs. A castle survived because someone quietly noticed the smallest details. The steward walked slowly through the granary. The cool air inside felt pleasant after the warmth outside. Sunlight entered only through narrow openings near the roof, creating long golden beams that drifted across the stacks of grain. Tiny specks of dust floated lazily in the still air. Every sack had been carefully stitched closed. Every barrel rested upon wooden blocks to keep it away from damp floors. Moisture was one of the greatest enemies of stored food. Even a small leak in the roof could spoil enough grain to feed dozens of people. The steward ran his hand across one sack. Perfectly dry. He nodded with quiet satisfaction. Nothing more needed to be said. Outside the granary stood the smokehouse. Its weathered oak door creaked softly as you stepped inside. The room was dim. Above your head, strips of pork and sides of bacon hung from thick wooden beams. Below them, a slow fire of oak and beech burned gently. There were no bright flames, only fragrant smoke rising steadily toward the rafters. Smoking meat was one of the oldest methods of preservation. Combined with salt, it allowed food to last for months. For families preparing for long winters, this simple technique was invaluable. The smoky aroma lingered on your clothes as you stepped back into the fresh air. Nearby, the dairy house remained wonderfully cool. Its thick stone walls protected butter, cheese, and fresh milk from the summer heat. Large earthenware crocks lined the shelves. Cream slowly rose to the surface of the milk. Later, it would be churned into butter using a tall wooden churn. The dairy maid greeted you with a warm smile. She had already been awake for hours. The cows had been milked shortly after sunrise. Fresh milk could not wait. Nature kept its own schedule. The dairy house smelled of fresh cream, clean straw, and cool stone. It was one of the most peaceful places in the castle. Just outside, a young shepherd led several sheep through the outer yard. Their thick wool rippled softly as they walked. A few curious lambs skipped playfully beside their mothers. Although sheep are often remembered for their wool, they also provided milk, cheese, and occasionally meat. To medieval families, every animal served more than one purpose. Nothing was kept without reason. The shepherd carried a simple wooden crook, polished smooth by years of use. It was neither decorated nor expensive. Yet it was exactly the right tool for his work. Many medieval tools shared that quiet perfection. Simple, reliable, built to last. As the morning continued, you crossed paths with the castle's laundresses. Several large tubs stood beside a small stream flowing through the lower courtyard. Fresh water rushed steadily over smooth stones. Wooden paddles rested nearby. Washing clothes in the Middle Ages demanded patience and strength. Soap was often made from animal fat mixed with wood ash. Linen garments were scrubbed carefully before being rinsed in clean water. Finally, they were spread across long ropes to dry beneath the summer sun. Rows of white linen fluttered gently in the breeze like sails on distant ships. The sight transformed an ordinary corner of the castle into something unexpectedly beautiful. Not far away, children gathered fallen feathers from the goose yard. Some would later become writing quills. A skilled scribe could trim the tip of a goose feather into a surprisingly precise pen. Many of the manuscripts that survive today were written with tools no more complicated than these simple feathers. Knowledge often depended upon humble objects. The feather, the ink, the steady hand. Near the chapel garden, the castle physician examined several medicinal plants. He gently touched the leaves of sage, smelled the flowers of lavender, collected a handful of yarrow. His understanding of medicine blended careful observation with centuries of inherited tradition. While many medieval treatments would not meet modern medical standards, physicians and herbalists were sincere students of the natural world. They learned by watching seasons, plants, and people over many years. Some remedies proved surprisingly effective. Others reflected the limited scientific knowledge of the time. Either way, they represented humanity's enduring desire to heal and to help. Above the courtyard, clouds drifted slowly across the bright blue sky. They cast moving shadows over the gardens and towers. For a few moments, the castle cooled pleasantly before sunlight returned. The gardener looked upward and smiled. "Good clouds," he murmured. "They'll keep the soil from drying too quickly." To someone who spent every day outdoors, even passing clouds became welcome companions. As noon approached, the smell of cooking began drifting once again from the kitchens. Leeks simmered in a large iron pot. Fresh herbs were chopped upon worn oak boards. The baker removed another batch of warm bread from the oven. Steam escaped as each loaf was placed upon wooden racks to cool. The familiar aroma spread through the courtyard. Workers smiled almost without thinking. Some scents have always meant the same thing: safety, comfort, home. You paused near the center of the courtyard and looked around once more. The castle was alive, not with excitement or grand celebrations, but with countless quiet acts of care. Someone repaired a roof. Someone baked bread. Someone fed the chickens. Someone sharpened tools. Someone tended flowers. Someone filled buckets from the well. These ordinary moments rarely found their way into royal chronicles. Yet they were the true foundation of medieval life. Kings might shape the borders of kingdoms, but ordinary people shaped the rhythm of every single day. And beneath the warm English sun, that gentle rhythm continued, just as it had yesterday, and just as it would again tomorrow. As the morning slowly gave way to midday, the castle settled into one of its calmest and most satisfying rhythms. The hardest work of the early hours had already been completed. Animals had been fed, bread had been baked, water had been drawn from the well. The gardens had been inspected. The workshops were busy, but no one seemed hurried. The castle breathed with quiet confidence. You carried a small basket toward the outer courtyard, where merchants occasionally arrived from nearby market towns. Today was not a great market day. Only a few familiar visitors appeared at the gate. One farmer guided a sturdy cart loaded with fresh cabbages. Another brought woven baskets filled with eggs, each carefully cushioned with clean straw. An elderly woman carried bundles of herbs tied neatly with linen string. She had gathered them from fields and hedgerows during the early morning. The gatekeeper welcomed each visitor by name. That was one of the quiet truths of medieval life. People often knew one another for decades. The castle was not simply a fortress. It was part of a community. Many of the same families had traded here for generations. Children who once arrived holding their parents' hands eventually returned as adults with children of their own. Life moved slowly enough for relationships to grow deep roots. Inside the courtyard, the steward carefully examined the day's deliveries. He lifted one cabbage, turned it over, smiled with approval. He checked the eggs for cracks. He thanked the farmer before recording the exchange on his wax tablet. Trust mattered, but careful records mattered too. Good management kept a castle running smoothly. Near the kitchens, the smell of fresh herbs drifted through the warm air: parsley, sage, dill, thyme. The cook accepted each bundle with genuine appreciation. Fresh herbs transformed simple meals into memorable ones. A pot of barley stew might feed the body. A handful of thyme and parsley could brighten both the meal and the spirit. As the visitors unloaded their goods, several chickens wandered curiously around the carts. One particularly bold hen discovered a grain sack that had not been tied tightly. Within moments she had gathered several companions. The gatekeeper laughed softly. News travels fast among chickens. Farmer simply smiled. He gently retied the sack. No harm had been done. Little moments like these happened almost every day. Few people remembered them for long. Yet together they gave ordinary life its quiet charm. A young apprentice carried the baskets into the pantry. The cool stone room remained one of the safest places for storing food during warm weather. Shelves lined the walls from floor to ceiling. Clay jars held dried beans. Wooden barrels contained oats and barley. Strings of garlic hung beside braided onions. Every shelf reflected months of careful preparation. Winter always seemed far away during summer. Wise people prepared for it anyway. Outside, the stable yard had become lively once more. The farrier finished shoeing a gray mare. As he gently lowered her hoof, he ran his hand along her leg to make certain she remained comfortable. Good horsemanship required patience more than strength. The mare nudged his shoulder gently before returning to her stall. Perhaps it was only curiosity, or perhaps, in her own quiet way, she was offering thanks. Nearby, A flock of pigeons circled above the castle roof before settling on the highest tower. Pigeons had lived alongside people for thousands of years. Some castles even maintained dovecotes where birds nested safely. Their droppings enriched gardens, and in some places, young pigeons provided an occasional source of meat. Nothing within the medieval landscape was without purpose. The old gardener knelt beside a bed of strawberries. He carefully tucked fresh straw beneath the ripening fruit. The straw helped keep the berries clean and reduced the risk of rot after rain. It was such a simple technique that gardeners still use it today. Some wisdom needs very little improvement. You paused beside him. He looked up with a gentle smile. "Plants," he said quietly, "teach patience better than any book." Then he returned to his work. His movements were slow, unhurried, almost meditative. Watching him made the entire garden seem even more peaceful. Far beyond the castle walls, the village church bell echoed faintly across the valley. Its sound mingled with the castle bell until both seemed to become one. Across the fields, farmers paused only briefly before continuing their work. Time was marked not by wristwatches or clocks, but by bells, sunlight, and familiar routines. People carried the rhythm of the day within themselves. In the workshop, the cooper tested a newly completed barrel by filling it with water. Everyone watched carefully. A single leak would mean hours of additional work. For several quiet moments, nothing happened. Then the cooper nodded with satisfaction. Not one drop escaped. The barrel was perfect. His apprentice smiled proudly. Learning a craft often meant waiting many years before hearing such quiet approval. It was worth the wait. At the edge of the orchard, children gathered fallen feathers left behind by passing geese. They laughed as the breeze carried the light feathers into the air. One child tucked a feather into his cap, pretending to be an important messenger riding to the king. The others laughed. Imagination required no expensive toys, only open fields and curious minds. As the sun reached its highest point, warmth settled gently across the countryside. The stone walls absorbed the heat. The gardens shimmered with butterflies. Honeybees continued their endless journeys between flowers. Even the castle dogs found a cool place beneath an old oak tree, where they stretched comfortably in the shade. The world itself seemed content. You leaned for a moment against the cool stones of the well. Looking around the courtyard, you noticed something history rarely pauses to celebrate. Nothing extraordinary was happening. And that was exactly what made the day extraordinary. Peace had allowed the baker to bake, the gardener to plant, the shepherd to guide his flock, the children to laugh, the carpenter to shape wood, the cook to prepare another simple meal. Perhaps the greatest gift any generation can receive is not glory, but an ordinary day filled with honest work, quiet friendship, warm bread, and the comforting certainty that, when tomorrow's sun rises over the castle walls, life will begin its gentle rhythm all over again.